Well, it feels good to be in familiar space and familiar ritual. I love this, so thank you. And as Alan had mentioned earlier, just a lovely thank you to Sarnia, Port Huron, for Bob, Barnes and the gang, and Anne and Alan, and the welcome to be here. And if I were to, I was going to get up and share a joy, and the joy for me, not only in being here, is that we have safe places, safe spaces like this in which to gather. And as you so rightly mentioned, is that really there are so few places in the world, and I think even in our own country, where we can gather to amongst like-minded folks to be able to celebrate. So let me just open up my words here, and perfect, and I'm impressed with your technology, with making these hybrid services work so well. So, and you all, if you haven't got a bookmark, you can take a couple. Please put them in all of your books, share them around. But a bookmark on the 7 principles of humanism. So, the topic for today was a secular humanism, a secular philosophy for our time. And what I wanted to suggest is, as we look at, there we go, this quote that you can read and see at home. Humanism is a progressive philosophy or life stance without supernatural that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead meaningful and ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. So that's a simple statement and captures in a nutshell what humanism is about. And as you know, there's always so much more. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of that today, and a bit of my journey. And okay, so in our talk today, I wanted to just touch on a number of key elements, and the first one up there. There we go. Hang on a second. I've got a little guide here. There we go. I'll touch a little bit about our history and a very brief history of Humanist Canada. I wanted to touch on UUU Principles and humanist values to see, just to share how similar the crossover is. To look at some census data and some trends and reasons for optimism and some of the challenges that free thinkers and progressives might face. So a little bit about me. Alan had touched on a bit of my history, and so I, as a member of First Unitarian congregation in Toronto, so I have roots as a Roman Catholic. So I was a cradle Catholic, and went through parochial school. At some point along the way, I realized that I sat so far in the edge of the church that I just fell off, as I say. But there were many values that I certainly didn't aspire to. One of those important transitions for me was along the way when I was in grad school. I actually have a master's in theology, so I consider myself an informed atheist humanist. And but realizing that so many of us have a very ahistorical notion generally in life. And for me, it was this experience of realizing that, the church, in fact, that, or churches that we know, or often just the society that we live in, we have very ahistorical notions of that. And all of a sudden, there was a course in church history that was this revolutionary. So I'm a great believer in the importance of history, not only because hopefully it would help us to repeat our mistakes, but we see lots of exceptions to that. But it really helps contextualize, our life. And so that was a big part of it. And then I realized that I had fallen in love, and realized that as a Roman Catholic and being a member of a religious community on the road to ordination, well, that was problematic. So I realized I was a nester, and my partner in life was an N. And so you can imagine the challenges with that and the church. However, I had always taken a liberal and was very positioned on things, so I was pretty clear about where life was for me. And what that has meant is that I've been with my husband now for 28 years, and we've been married for 18. So we got married a year after same-sex marriage became legal in Ontario. So it's particularly exciting for me to be in any gathering, and especially here in Sarnia, Port Huron, where you're a welcoming congregation. I think it's, so congratulations. But let me turn for a moment then to Humanist Canada. It's hard to believe, but Humanist Canada was founded on May 5th, 1968. So we're past our 50-year anniversary. What's that, a silver jubilee? What's that? Or is it gold? Okay, but it's a significant milestone. And we had our roots from the former Humanist Fellowship of Montreal. Our founding president was the renowned Dr. Henry Morgentaler, as you probably all know, now a recipient of the Order of Canada, the late Henry Morgentaler, who was a physician and activist for women's reproductive rights and choice. And again, somebody who single-handedly made a difference in this country by making abortion available, and someone who was willing to go to jail for those values. And after repeated incarcerations, finally the government had realized that there was no hope for any prosecution. And so single-handedly, so never doubt what one person can do to bring about change. And then in 1996, Humanist Canada petitioned the province of Ontario. At the time, the only way that you could get married would be by clergy or a justice of the peace. And so we were subsequently successful, and were granted the right as a body to officiate or solemnize marriages in the province. And truthfully, we're the only province in Canada in which humanists can officiate. And I'll share a couple of numbers about that later. So that was 1996. Fast forward to 2018, Humanist Canada hired its first program director. I was president at the time and realized, as you all know, is that you can volunteerism and ensuring that we're going to be around for a time has its challenges. And I recognized that, as did the board, that there was no way we could continue to grow humanist presence and offer the programs that were needed and necessary by simply a group of volunteers of 8 people. And so we hired our first staff as a program director, Anna Popovich, and she happens to have a PhD and has contributed greatly to the organization. And then I wanted to jump a little further to 2021, and we were successful. We welcomed the first humanist chaplain in the Canadian Armed Forces in CAF, Marie-Claire Kadaji. And what's significant about this is not only is she the first humanist chaplain in the Canadian Armed Forces, she's the first humanist chaplain in North America. and the US military. She was just attending a gathering of military chaplains in the US, and they said, we're not ready for that yet. So once again, Canada, humanism is making a difference. So UU Principles. And what time did I start, Ellen?
Yeah, you have lots of time.
Lots of time, okay. And you know, I always find that the time disappears so quickly, so, and there we go. So UU Principles. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, only because you folks know your UU Principles. And so I had listed them here, and because I really wanted to jump in a moment to our Amsterdam Declaration. But as you look at the at the UU Principles, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, acceptance of one another, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And then we know your eighth principle, which is adds a diversity, equity, and inclusion element, which is so important. The individual and communal action and accountability that dismantles racism and systemic barriers to full inclusion in ourselves and our institutions. So, powerful principles. And so I wanted to share just for a moment then how similarly they parallel are the principles that guide humanism. And probably as UUs are a non-creedal tradition, certainly humanists are not don't have any form of a creed, but in terms of principles and values. So the fundamentals of modern humanism. And so if we look, humanism is ethical. It affirms the worth and dignity and autonomy of the individual and the right of every human being to the greatest possible freedom, compatible with the rights of others. Humanists have a duty of care to all humanity, including future generations. Humanists believe that morality is an intrinsic part of human nature, based on understanding and a concern for others, needing no external sanction. Secondly, humanism is rational. It seeks to use science creatively, not destructively. Humanists believe that solutions to the world's problems lie in human thought and action, rather than any divine intervention. Humanism advocates the application of the methods of science and free inquiry to the problems of human welfare. But humanists also believe that the application of science and technology must be tempered by human values. Science gives us the means, but human values must propose the ends. Humanism supports democracy and human rights. It aims at the fullest possible development of every human being. It holds that democracy and human development are matters of right. The principles of democracy and human rights can be applied to many human relationships and are not restricted to methods of government. Humanism also insists that personal liberty must be combined with social responsibility. It ventures to build a world on the idea of the free person responsible to society and recognizes our dependence and our responsibility for the natural world. Humanism is undogmatic, imposing no creed upon its adherents. It is thus committed to education free from indoctrination. Sounding familiar to your UU principles? Humanism is a response to widespread demand for an alternative to dogmatic religion. For the world's major religions claim to be based on revelations fixed for all time, and many seek to impose their worldviews on all of humanity. So humanism recognizes that reliable knowledge of the world and of ourselves arises through a continuing process of observation, evaluation, and revision. And humanism also values the artistic creativity and imagination and recognizes the transforming power of art and all of the arts. So lovely to be in presence of live music and to know how that lifts our being. Humanism affirms the importance of literature and music and the visual performing arts for personal development and fulfillment. And then finally, humanism is a life stance, aiming at the maximum possible fulfillment through the cultivation of ethical and creative living, and offers an ethical and rational means of addressing the challenges of our times. For humanism can be a way of life for everyone, everywhere. So these are some of the guiding values then which gather around that we gather around. And of course, just as in Unitarian Universalism, there is no one way of thinking about things, and conversation and dialogue is always central. So true with humanism. So let's look for a moment. I wanted to put up this slide on the Canadian census trends. So recently there was the release of the census data. And so what I wanted to highlight is, when we talk about humanism being a progressive movement, but as our world continues to change, is that it's the timing right now to be able to, as people find themselves, there are fewer and fewer attending formal religious groups, how important it is for us to be able to be present and to provide not just an alternative, but another way of looking and being in the world. So if we look at 2021, so these results that were just released, you can see that the number of folks that don't declare religious affiliation at 34.6. So in the last census 10 years ago in 2011, that number was 23.9. And if we look 20 years ago to 2001, you'll see 16.5%. So the trend is, and of course, this is aggregated data. So if you start to scratch at this, you'll begin to see, of course, that the younger the generation, the greater the number who don't identify with any religious affiliation. Now, where the census data falls short, of course, is that people are asked to identify if they belong to a particular tradition. And so what I would suggest to you, so the numbers are skewed lower here. And I'll say why in a moment. But if the question were to be asked and more clearly focused on do you identify as being active in a particular denomination, what those numbers would look like. And I think probably we would all be able to recognize those numbers would be lower. By way of example, I officiate about 100 marriages a year. And of those marriages, I can tell you the number of folks who would identify in the marriage license as being none, they leave it blank, or they would say none, or they would identify as being atheist, humanist, agnostic, again, are a small number. Most folks on the marriage license identify as some religious tradition, which clearly they're not active in because I'm working with them as an officiant. Or they've identified as non-denominational. And as I say, there is no such denomination as non-denominational. So we know they're not active in any tradition. So you can see all of a sudden is that these numbers are heavily skewed. And so the number of folks who don't identify as religious is much higher. And then the next step, of course, for us would be able to provide an opportunity for people on the census to actually proactively identify as humanist, atheist, or agnostic, or non-believer, or secular believer. So I don't know what that language would look like at this point, but I think the next step is for our census to actually provide that opportunity rather than none other. Okay, so interesting stats. So of course, as I look at those numbers is that, and our membership in Humanist Canada across the country is about 850 individuals. And if I look at the number, I mean, even here in your the Sarnia Fellowship is that there are probably many more Unitarian Universalists in the area. I know across the country there are many more people who would identify as humanist or don't have a framework for identifying. So we begin to, provide education. And as the earlier quote that we had on our website, that many people might be UUs or humanists, but they just don't even realize it yet, or realize that that's an opportunity. Where we should have 10,000 in our organization, and if we were just to look at what the census trends might suggest. But there are many who don't even recognize where they might fit in. So trends. Well, obviously, one of the trends that we've just touched on in terms of the census is that, traditional religion is in a steep decline, and that's not going to recover. So what happens in the meantime is that we need to be providing a space for people to self-identify. The second trend that I just had wanted to highlight, and I'm going to make reference to a couple of sources, and Steven Pinker, the psychologist, highlights in his book Enlightenment Now, where that things are actually getting better in the world. I think if you read the newspaper, what do you get a sense of? Things are getting worse, and absolutely. And so there's a confirmation bias that gets built into. And we know in US politics is that, fear motivates people to do strange things. And so bad news motivates people. And so you can have a sense that things are actually getting worse. But Steven Pinker, has anybody read Enlightenment Now? So I would encourage it. It's a rather thick volume, but he actually goes into great detail and identifies really that by every measure, and he provides the statistics for this, factors such as in health, wealth, equality, human rights, despite what we might be seeing in Iran at the moment. So there are certainly challenging places around the world. Equality, human rights, happiness, peace, and freedom, that all of those indicators have improved over time and all around the world. And notwithstanding that there are pockets where we have issues. And he says the driving force of all of this is actually, the driving force of this progress is the values of reason, science, and humanism. Liberal thinking, secular thinking, that these values that are derived from the European Enlightenment. The next that I wanted to touch on was a book by Mark Schaus, and it's titled Dispatches on Global Secular Progress. And I happen to be quoted in there a number of times, but he interviews some major figures in free thinking, and what he had identified that one of the best qualities of humanist secular movement is our critical thinking approach and the evolution of ideas. It seems pretty simple, but it's a culture of healthy curiosity and skepticism and constant questioning rather than relying on doctrines that are fixed in time and place that create the space for this movement. And thirdly, I want to suggest a book that has been transformative for me, and I'll touch on your comment about spirituality in a moment, Alan. But this is a book written by Emily Estefany Smith, and it's titled The Power of Meaning, finding fulfillment in a world obsessed with happiness. And she identifies that there are 4 pillars that are part of making for a meaningful life. And those 4 pillars are belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling. And so let me just touch on each of those pillars in it briefly. So belonging, it simply comes from being in relationships where you feel valued, where you feel connected. Why do we gather in a place such as this? We have folks that are gathering home in this hybrid model, but to feel part of a larger movement is really important. But being in relationships where you feel valued. Purpose. So belonging and purpose is using your skills to serve others. Transcendence, a third pillar, is our being connected to something outside of ourselves. So often we have, the language which we think about transcendent as being a religious term. I certainly was educated with that. So this idea about transcendence is actually a secular word and a secular value. Alan, you had mentioned, but to be able to stand on the shore of the lake and to have a sense of the immensity of it all, and to recognize that we're part of this interconnected web of existence. To be able to say sunset or sunrise, to hold a baby, to listen to live music, that these are all pieces that this humanism isn't simply about something that's a cognitive piece as much as we talk about critical thinking and rational and science, but it's an embodied experience. So transcendence, being connected to something outside of ourselves. And storytelling, or what we call narrative, is the story we tell ourselves, not just as individuals, but as a community. And the wonderful thing about storytelling and narrative is that it's something that's ongoing. We continue to re-author and retell our stories, and in that process, why is it's so important to understand the history of Sarnia and fellowship? Why is it important to understand the history of our organizations? Because they help shape our future. So that was trends and reasons for optimism. And again, so I've touched on this in already, but I'm going to suggest a number of ways that we might, and for reasons to be optimistic. And the first is that, I'd mentioned earlier, if we look at Henry Morgentaler, somebody who made a lifelong change in the country for women's reproductive rights. But that how simple it can be for each and every one of us individually. Earlier today, we were talking about the importance of making, if one person writes a letter, that we can have an impact, but if 50 of us write a letter, that can make for a bigger impact. And if Sarnia UU has some a project that you wanted to take on that could be supported by the CUC, that's an even bigger impact. So this idea of the ripple effect. So this first reason for optimism that I'd say is that that it gets rooted in is the importance of staying in the loop, that we know what issues are and who the players are, so that we can organize and so that we can make change in the world and hold our leaders accountable and create a world in which we all aspire to. Joining and spending time with other like-minded folks. And I'm going to use, in particular in humanism, I think with other pro-secular organizations is empowering to know that you're not alone. I wonder how many of you, as you use over time, found yourself here and realized, oh, I belong here in a way that I never knew prior to. and the importance of taking action in some kind of way, and to be an ally for others. We realize that we may not agree with everybody on every point, but when we rally together, we share much more in common than we do in our differences. I think collectively why I'm optimistic is because of the Humanist Canada. And some of the things that we've been able to do. So we launched with our program director, for example, monthly webinars, and to realize that those are, and the gifts sometimes of COVID, in which we realize that wherever you are in the country, that you would have an opportunity a number of times in the month, whether it's for a book club, whether it's for a webinar, whether it's for a course, to be able to take those and to realize that knowledge is power and how it transforms lives. So we began offering courses. Chris DiCarlo, if he's a name familiar to some of you, who his specialty is critical thinking. So we've offered critical thinking courses. Or another example would be end-of-life literacy, that so many of us, again, the importance of being, how do you embrace the end of life as a humanist? We know that there are all kinds of folks who, if you believe in an afterlife, for example, that you have a lens in which you live and orient your life. And so as humanists, as the principle is that how do you make sense of end of life when this is all we have? And it's a good life. And so being able to cherish that, not be looking at, what an afterlife may look like. And then I wanted to highlight our ceremonies program. I mentioned it was launched in 1996. And if you look at in Humanist Canada, we have 87 humanist chaplains in the province, and 87 officiants. And the Ontario Humanist Society, which is the other organization that has officiants, they have about 51. So that's 138 humanist officiants, not including Unitarian lay chaplains, and in a population of almost 15 million people. So you can see how underserviced, in fact, humanist rites of passage would be in the province. And similarly, there are 23,000 who are identified as clergy in the province, and we have only 138 humanist officiants. So one of my reasons for optimism is that there's lots of room to grow the program. And then more recently, as I'd mentioned, there we go, is that we launched a chaplaincy program. And so you'll see on the far right is Marie Claire Kanaji, who is the CAF chaplain. And we had she did a webinar yesterday marking the incredible work that she's been able to do. So for example, did anybody watch the Remembrance Day service from in Ottawa? Well, if you hadn't, what I wanted to highlight was, again, so this is one of the impact that we've already begun to have. So the Chaplain General, this year for the first time, instead of it being opened with a prayer, it was opened with a reflection. There was no mention of prayer, there was no mention of God, but it was a moment of reflection. It was a lengthy moment of reflection, but how significant this is for the military, and indeed, so we began to talk about these are already beginning changes. There are all kinds of rituals that take place in the military, and to have those reflected to be much more inclusive would be welcome. Shrishti Huku is now, she's working on a double PhD at the University of Ottawa. She also works for the federal government, and so she's a chaplain at the University of Ottawa. These are unpaid positions with the exception of the military. Marty Shoemaker, who's at Kwantlen College in BC in Vancouver, is a chaplain. He's now become recognized as the Humanist chaplain for a couple of the local hospitals. So now when they have folks that identify as being secular believers, they actually have a chaplain that they can identify. And then there's me. And so I'm chaplain right now to the organization. My hands are more than full as president, and so as that changes, I look to be moving into the University of Toronto and looking at some other specialties around MAID, for example. So these are all things that leave me feeling excited. So finally, and just to finish up, and I've gone way over time, I know, oh, the next slide too. Is there yes. Thank you. The next slide would have been, challenges, and I think the challenge, as I'll finish, now is, of course, some of the big challenges, as we look around the world, human rights are very frail and fragile. If we look at Roe v. Wade being overturned in the US, if we look at, the electoral system, abortion being banned in many states, we look at some of the challenges that it can be difficult in Canada, even to access abortions if you're in Atlantic Canada because of availability. So there are lots of challenges that we continue to face. But I'm mindful, Steven Pinker, that that if we get too focused on some of those areas where there are challenges, we'll lose track of progress that we've made. And I think Made in Canada might be an example of that. But the other final challenge is that time, dollars, and people, and are some of the huge challenges Unitarians face. How do we mobilize? And how do we, so we really need to be looking towards each other as allies as we move forward. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you have a better sense of humanism, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much.